and certainly timely discussion as part of the 2021 Progressive Governance Digital Summit. It's a session focusing on Europe's sovereignty post-pandemic, and it's a session that has been co-designed by DPZ, FES, and FEPS. My name is Vasilis Dousas. I'm a senior international relations policy advisor at FEPS and an academy associate at Chatham House. And before commencing with our discussion and presenting our wonderful panel, let me briefly start with a few house rules. As you will probably have observed by now, this is an on-the-record session. So those active on social media, please feel free to tweet or disseminate otherwise using the hashtag PGS21. There will also be a Q&A session in the end. So participants, you, the audience, you'll have the chance to pose your questions, but please do so using the chat function here on Zoom. And as always, make your questions short, succinct, state your name, and please address them to a specific speaker, which certainly always helps. At the end of the session, I've been asked to inform you that there will be a feedback form that will be circulated again in the chat function. So please make sure to fill that out. It's quite important for all the organizers and the PGS team. Finally, let me offer the excuses, the apologies on behalf of Martin Schulz, the chairman of the FES, whom you might have seen in the agenda, but who unfortunately cannot be with us this afternoon due to an urgent, unforeseen development. Now, today's session focuses on European strategic autonomy, European sovereignty, as is otherwise known. And by now, it's fair to say that it's almost a truism to suggest that strategic autonomy, the concept, has seen a meteoric rise in its use in Brussels, but also across many national capitals. This, despite the persistent lack of clarity surrounding many aspects of the term, and certainly the use of the term sovereignty in certain contexts and the term autonomy in others is suggestive of this lack of clarity. But nonetheless, the term has come to encapsulate the general objective or ambition of the EU to enhance its freedom to conduct its policy autonomously according to its own preferences, rules, and legal framework, but also its freedom from specific sets of dependencies, and certainly the pandemic laid bare some of these dependencies. Now, in parallel to these discussions over strategic autonomy's meaning, policy implications, and policy content becoming all the more significant, we also have the need for the progressive agenda, for the progressive movement to come up with a sensible proposal on where to direct and how to operationalize strategic autonomy. And this is becoming increasingly urgent, not least because of the mounting geopolitical competition at a global level, but also the profound challenges that exist within each transatlantic partner. And as far as Europe is concerned, not only beyond European borders, but also within European borders. Now, as I said, we have a fantastic panel, a great group of people with us today to help us unpack this complex, uncertain landscape and perhaps decode some of the actors and factors that are in play when it comes to discussions of strategic autonomy. We're joined by Kati Piri, who has been serving as a member of the Dutch House of Representatives since earlier this year, as a member of the Dutch Labour Party. Previously, she was a member of the European Parliament within the Progressive Alliance of Socialists and Democrats there. And in that role, she also served as vice chairwoman of the S&D group, primarily active in the fields of foreign affairs, human rights, civil liberties, and defense. We're also joined by Ian Lesser. Dr. Lesser is Vice President at the German Marshall Fund of the United States and a member of GMF's executive team. He also serves as the Executive Director of the Brussels office of GMF and leads GMF's work on the Mediterranean, Turkey, and the wider Atlantic. And last but certainly not least, Natalie Tocci. Natalie Tocci is the Director of Istituto Affari Internazionali in Rome and an honorary professor at the University of Tübingen. She's currently a special advisor to EU High Representative Josep Borrell. And prior to this, she also served as special advisor to Mr. Borrell's predecessor, Federica Mogherini. And in that role, she was the author of the European Global Strategy. And I should say she has worked copiously on its implementation since the publication of the strategy. So welcome to all three of you.
Thank you.
Let me start with Ms. Piri, and let me start with something that I think is quite central to any discussion about Europe's sovereignty or autonomy. And that's, of course, the agenda of democracy, of the rule of law, the bedrock of liberal democratic values and norms that lies at the core of the EU, at the core of the US, but also of the way that both transatlantic partners can stand credibly in the world, but also be seen as defending their own values in the eyes of their own citizens. Now, Ms. Piri, you've worked extensively on democracy. It's a topic that is super close to your heart. It's becoming clear by the day that transatlantic cooperation on this agenda should become a priority. But I'm wondering to hear your thoughts on what you think this prioritization means in concrete policy terms. And I'm linking that to the fact that I alluded to earlier, the fact and the undeniable fact that there is increasing competition at global level between different political systems, between different value systems. And of course, I should add very cheekily, how do you see Europe's quest for strategic autonomy fitting into this whole puzzle? Ms. Piri, the virtual floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Vasilis, and it's an honor for me to participate in this panel together with Natalie and Ian. Very pleased to see you, at least digitally, and I think on a very important topic. I'm always afraid to talk about strategic autonomy, especially when the person is in the room who came up with the term. So it's a difficult start, but let me try to give an answer to your question. I think, looking at the definition, how I see strategic autonomy in this request is a way that the EU should use its strength to promote an open world economy with fair rules, promoting more equality, tackling climate change, and provide more security also in the broader sense. And I think what has become clear is it also needs to be assertive. And what does that mean? In my view, it means that the EU can no longer rely any longer on just being the global leading example of soft power. That means, of course, a more effective use of available EU instruments, political and in economic terms, in order to defend European values. When it comes to also the autonomy of internal decision making. We have had hundreds of examples, unfortunately, where we know that both Russia and China have sometimes people in the European Council who are making sure that we don't have that autonomous decision making. And this, of course, reduces, this would reduce the influence of external parties. And for this, a concrete thing that many by now prime ministers and foreign ministers are openly pleading for is to change, of course, also the decision making when it comes to foreign policy. And then we come to the second issue, which is because very often, in my opinion, the EU gives the impression that it wants to avoid a competition on values with authoritarian Russia and China. And, not seeing it also as a systemic competition, then you're not really answering. How can you have a value-based policy if you're not recognizing the different systems and the systemic threats. And then we have to add there that, of course, the EU's global role also starts at home. I don't have to mention to you, we had many debates, unfortunately, for many years already, about the erosion of the rule of law and the quality of democracy also within the EU. So if you want to have credible foreign policy based, a value-based foreign policy, it automatically also means, of course, you have to take care of what is happening inside your own house. And then as a fourth point, I would say when it comes to EU hard security, of course, this is where we don't have a tradition as the European Union. And some say perhaps this is the time to start it. I'm a bit more hesitant on that because, my question is, do we really want the EU to become a cynical and addicted to a realpolitik as perhaps China and Russia are? I believe the strength of the European Union is in other terms. So in the end, we need to organize ourselves better and put EU's enormous range of instruments also to more effective use, where I think we still have many, many chances in the future to improve that compared to where we stand at this moment, Vasilis.
Many thanks, Kati. Two quick questions. One is, how closely do you see questions of strategic autonomy linked to the fate of liberal democracies? So to the evolution, to the deepening of the liberal democratic tradition in our own countries? Because as you said, I agree, there's an internal aspect when it comes to strategic autonomy, given the tremendous work that needs to happen at home on both sides of the Atlantic to address these signs of exhaustion in our democracies. But I want to probe a little bit deeper also when it comes to the external aspect of that. How do you see Europe and in cooperation with the US, of course, operationalize this agenda of strategic autonomy vis-a-vis authoritarian states? You then talked about being more assertive when it comes to our values, but in concrete policy terms, how do you see this agenda being operationalized on the ground going forward?
Well, I think to come to your first question, for me, strategic autonomy is not an end goal in itself. It's a means to achieve what we want to achieve, and that is to have still a value-based European Union, but also, as a way to also contribute to a multilateral system. And for this, we need to have internal cohesion, and we need to be also internally well organized. Now, when it comes to practical terms, today we had a meeting, for instance, with the advisor of Alexei Navalny, Mr. Volkov, in the Dutch Parliament, and he very much said that, of course, we always appreciate, the strong words that are there when it comes, for instance, to human rights abuses, but sometimes we miss the action in place. And the action is, of course, much more than just about sanctions, right? I mean, in terms of trade, we are a global player, just as much as China is, just as much as the US is. This is, I think, the field where it's clear that the EU can do much more when it comes to, in terms of trade policy. We can't say that in the military way, of course. Standing up for the sovereignty of Ukraine, standing up for what we see, the authoritarian trend happening in Turkey and what we saw last summer happening in the Mediterranean. EU could be and should, I think, do much more than just statements of concern, but also come to action. For instance, as you know, in the last years, I was for 5 years the rapporteur on Turkey for the European Parliament. And we always failed to actually instrumentalize the enormous trade and economic card we have vis-a-vis a big neighbor like Turkey in order to, to put pressure when it comes to the authoritarian trend happening there. You see other countries using the trade and economic instruments to a much bigger extent than Europe is. And I think it's time that we learn to also use the tools that we have and make them also, value driven. And this is, I think, one of the big challenges for Europe in the past. And we should not forget that, of course, you know, for an unjust world cannot be democratic. So setting an agenda for democracy and human rights, also in the wake when we come out of this COVID-19 crisis, has to be, of course, also accompanied by more equal and better access to public goods, such as education and healthcare, and more equality, because that is just as much part of the, you know, the EU values as an open economy and democracy and respect for human rights is.
Many thanks. A lot to unpack there, and I'm sure we'll come back to some of that in the Q&A session. Let me now turn to Ian Lesser and shift to an area where Kathy, you certainly alluded to as Europe not being so strong on, and that's the hard security, the defense aspect. Mr. Lesser, defense is an area that is critical to strategic autonomy questions, at least as far as Europe is concerned, but it's also an area where the meaning of autonomy is contested, not only within Europe, but also to an extent between the two transatlantic partners. We have seen US opposition to EU defense integration being present at least since the 1990s, of course, fluctuating depending on the specifics, the administration in power. But an oft-cited concern that has been traditionally voiced on the part of Washington is that EU defense integration will to some extent lead to duplication with NATO and therefore to a weakening of the alliance. And at the same time, defense policy, once the ultimate taboo domain for the EU, has experienced tremendous progress over the past few years, not least since the unveiling of the EU global strategy in 2016. Now, if we agree that a stronger Europe should ideally mean a stronger transatlantic partnership, I'm wondering what you think are the ways in which we can ensure that investing more and better in European defense would lead indeed to a strengthening and a deepening of transatlantic ties in this domain.
Vasilis, thank you very much, and good to be with you. You know, it's an interesting question. You know, there is a history to this, of course, and you're right to say that there has been in the past decades a degree of American anxiety about what it would mean to have a stronger European character to defense in Europe. Actually, I think a lot of the edges sort of came off that debate. There have been ups and downs, but I think for the most part, the American strategic class has come to terms with the idea of Europe being a more capable actor, sees it in American interest to have that happen. And if, you know, if that's the price of having Europe spend more and do more, then so be it. I think that's really the center of gravity of the view in the United States now. Now, I do think the Trump administration was something of an outlier on this. They were a throwback in some ways to a much more concerned era, but they also were influenced by the fact that, you know, let's be honest, they didn't take the European Union as an actor very seriously. They didn't wish it well. They didn't have that kind of in their DNA, the idea that the US was kind of present at the creation of the European Union, of the European project, as Americans like to say. I think you now see a return to something much more traditional. Does it mean that all of the frictions around this concept go away? No, it doesn't. But I think broadly speaking, if you look across the range of things, both in the hard power area, but also the soft power area, you're now in a moment of convergence. Now, what we do with that, how we use it, you know, is an open question, and there's a lot that one can talk about. In some ways, you know, Trump gave history a shove here, you know, in terms of the European debate over strategic autonomy, sovereignty, whatever vocabulary you want to use. But how much of this, you know, how much of this will last? Perhaps quite a lot. I would just, one cautionary note, and I think it applies to the United States as much as it might to Europe. You know, we have our own sovereignty issues. We're very good at this, in fact. We you know, easily fall into this kind of sovereignty conscious, rather nationalistic approach to to defense. So I think the point here is, if open and European are really part of the discourse, then great. If it's much more about autonomy than it is about Europe or openness, not so great from a transatlantic perspective.
But again, probing a little bit deeper, and this question comes at a time when President Biden is making his first foreign trip as president to Europe. I mean, the Biden administration, for all intents and purposes, one of the most transatlantic friendly ones in living memory, and certainly the president himself, a true believer, somebody who cherishes the transatlantic relationship. So you alluded to the fact that there's a lot to talk about when it comes to how the Biden administration is to maneuver this landscape. So if you were to advise the Biden administration, how would you advise them to push the EU to develop its defense capabilities, while of course working hard to ensure closer EU-NATO cooperation and coordination?
That's what I would advise them. It's well, easier said than done, of course, but I mean, I think that is the thrust of the policy now. There's also a domestic context to this, of course, and I find it very interesting that there is, again, with different vocabulary, there's a parallel in the United States when the Biden administration talks about a foreign policy that works for the American middle class. You wouldn't put it that way necessarily in Europe, but you see similar kind of discourse in Europe around the benefits of a more kind of sovereignty-driven approach. It takes different forms in different places. It's also across the political spectrum. I mean, you can find versions of this on both sides of the Atlantic that are quite nationalistic, quite protectionist, quite sovereignty conscious, and not particularly interested in kind of a more multilateral approach to things. So that, their sovereignty and autonomy, it plays out differently on different parts of the political spectrum. Some people talk about societies that protect. The pandemic surely is going to give this a shove, that citizens will be looking, quite understandably, for more protection, broadly speaking, from governments. How does that play into this? It could play quite substantially in this on both sides of the Atlantic. So I think there is some political work here to do as well. But, as much as Trump may have given this a shove, I think you now have a very different actor with a very different set of interests in Washington. And it's really an opportunity for Europe and those who really see this as a sort of ongoing project for Europe and the world.
Many thanks. And if I might, just a quick follow-up, because you certainly alluded to Biden's bold domestic agenda and investment in the US. So do you see any link between that agenda, that investment in the US, to the state of Europe, European strategic autonomy? And if there is a link, how important is that link?
Well, I think these things come into play, especially at the level of technology and the extent to which we want to invest in national champions, and all the rest of it. I think, it's a moment of great investment, actually. And so that's an advantage. It seems to me we ought to be able to capture at least some of that investment on both sides of the Atlantic for transatlantic purpose, that it doesn't just pull us in different directions. Of course, we have China in the background that's driving a lot of this. But, clearly there are efficiencies to be captured from the United States and Europe doing more on this front together, and we're not here to talk about, harmonizing tax policy and things like that, but it also bears on this. Climate is part of it. Health policy is part of it. But defense is part of it too. And I do think, there will be a tremendous US interest in joining the defense industrial pieces of this. As Norway and others the US has signed up as well to PESCO. So, I think the more that can be done on that front will help the Biden administration stave off the critics who will say, yeah, but we're being squeezed out of a European defense market by all of this. And you don't want them to have to face more of that critique, it seems to me.
You're right, and you're certainly right in making the point, which I think is quite important, that strategic autonomy is not just about security and defense, not about foreign policy. It's about health policy, digital policy, trade, industrial, economic policy, and so on. So finding the right interlinkages between these policy areas and breaking down with the siloed attitude of the past. Natalie, let me turn to you. We've heard a lot about the risk of a strategic autonomy agenda turning into a protectionist, into an isolationist agenda. And we can see that risk from trade to digital. So what steps do you think should be taken at European level so the strategic autonomy debate does not translate into a drift towards protectionism or isolationism? And for that matter, what do you think this means for the transatlantic partnership?
Well, thank you, Vasilis. And I think it's important to start off with a recognition that that risk is there. You know, in many respects, I think it's only really becoming clear now in a way in which it wasn't when this term first emerged in the debate. I mean, I frankly, which then connects to the transatlantic piece of it, I frankly never really bought into the kind of criticism, don't do strategic autonomy because it's going to weaken the transatlantic relationship, which is obviously mainly articulated in terms of security and defense. And I never really bought into it for the simple reason that, I mean, it's just so not going to happen. We're so kind of, you know, light years away becoming autonomous in security and defense, that the idea that, you know, there would be a weakening of the transatlantic relationship always seemed to me to be kind of complete pie in the sky. And therefore, to me, when it came to security and defense in relation to the transatlantic relationship, I always saw it the other way around. You know, I always saw it very much, I think, along the lines of what Ian was also mentioning, of Europeans taking upon themselves greater risk, greater responsibility in security and defense, and actually this being the prerequisite, not only of greater European security, but also of greater Euro-Atlantic security, given that inevitably to me, a stronger transatlantic partnership and alliance in the 21st century requires a rebalancing in a sense, and therefore of Europeans taking greater responsibility, particularly when it comes to our part of the world, broadly speaking. So I never really got the point of the transatlantic criticism, because as I said, I never saw it as being particularly realistic. Having said that, I do think that as this concept has been rightly, I would say, stretched to different policy areas, as it has come to, sort of touch various aspects of industrial policy, of digital, of climate, of energy. And I think it's important to sort of start with a reflection of why has it extended to these other areas. And I think the reason why it has extended to these other areas is because there are powers, and obviously here I'm mainly thinking about Russia and about China, that are trying to harm and interfere in European norms and rules and values. And so there is a protection element to strategic autonomy as applied in these areas. And given that obviously in these areas, the European Union is far more developed than it is in the area of security and defense, I do think that there is indeed a risk that protection slips into protectionism. And incidentally, and I think, Ian was absolutely right, one can read the European debate on strategic autonomy, particularly as applied to these particular areas, as being the European equivalent of Biden's foreign policy for the middle class. I think we're both after the same thing, and we both run the same risk of basically starting from a healthy premise, and that healthy premise is that of saying, well, there are sort of some that are trying to interfere. So protection is a healthy, in a sense, goal to pursue. And by the way, if we don't pursue it, and this was very clear in the US case, but I think it's equally clear in the European case, although it's never really associated to strategic autonomy. If we don't do it, then the nationalists and the populists are going to be back. I mean, this is what underpins the American foreign policy for the middle class. And I think mutatis mutandis, it also applies to the European strategic autonomy debate. But how to avoid, as I said, sort of letting protection slip into protectionism, that risk is there. And I think, you know, when, for instance, you know, the Commission talks about an open strategic autonomy, it does so rightly pointing to a potential contradiction and a potential tension, if you like, between the two. So to me, in a sense, I mean, I would say there's no sort of silver bullet solution to all this, although recognizing the tension, I think, is the place to start. I would say that if there is one sort of guideline to follow in sort of, you know, walking that fine line of protection without protectionism, I would kind of put it in the slogan sort of governing interdependence. So it is about, you know, it may be in some respects about reducing certain asymmetric interdependencies or dependencies, which are then quote unquote weaponized as they have been. So there is inevitably an element of that. But it is mainly about governing interdependence rather than reducing interdependencies. And I think that is basically what we're after. The governing interdependence does inevitably mean that there is a greater institutional public sector role, if you like, than there was in the sort of days in which one simply assumed that markets would do their thing. You know, I think many of the challenges and the threats that we're facing, beginning with the greatest one of all, which is the climate crisis, is in a sense a massive market failure. So obviously there is a need, in a sense, for a greater institutional or a greater public role. I think, you know, we're living through a time in which state-society relations are actually being fundamentally questioned and re-questioned. They should have done, in my view, after the global financial crisis. Didn't quite happen as planned. I mean, good that it's happening now. So, you know, I think that this is where these debates, you know, sort of come in. And I think, you know, as Kati was saying, the openness should remain, in a sense, part of that picture, but it is about governing that openness. It's about governing the interdependencies as the only way to, I think, sort of tread that very fine line between the healthy goal of protectionism and the unhealthy outcome of protectionism.
Thanks, Natalie. That's one risk. Recently, you also wrote this long piece about strategic autonomy where you referred to another risk, and that is directly linked to this concept of governing interdependencies, which is a far more internal European dimension of governing interdependencies. And that risk is, as you put it, the risk that the pursuit of strategic autonomy may actually facilitate an undue concentration of power within the single market by individual companies or groups of member states. And it's more the latter part that I'd be interested in hearing your thoughts about. If we are to move to a European model of acting together, does this mean that we're moving to a model where fewer states agree and many more states simply follow?
Yeah, I mean, I think indeed that is the other major internal risk. I mean, this obviously connects to the debate about European champions. Again, it starts from a healthy debate. You know, I mean, it's clear that we cannot simply. I mean, the single market was conceived. I mean, think about competition policy. It was mainly conceived to ensure competition within the single market. As sort of unfair competition practices are coming externally from external players, what do we do? You know, think about the debate about level playing field with China. Yes, we would love China to liberalize and level the playing field by leveling up our standards. But China is not liberalizing. So what do we do if we want to level the playing field? Do we have to level it down, which gets us back into the protectionism, if you like, debate? Or internally, do we actually strengthen our own competitiveness vis-a-vis others? I mean, the fact that the whole debate on industrial policy, I mean, we hadn't been talking about industrial policy for what, 40 years? And now, I mean, it's not just us as Europeans. I mean, Americans are talking about industrial policy. I mean, it's back into the debate. But then comes the question, how do you support European champions? Well, if just left as is, inevitably, I think it's going to increase imbalances within the union. It's going to strengthen the strong. I mean, if you want to be more competitive at the global level, the obvious thing to do is to strengthen those that are already strong. In fact, get them to group together, Alstom, Siemens, etc. I think there is, though, another route, which is perhaps more complicated, which indeed sort of requires certainly, I mean, going back to the role of institutions and the role of the public sector, it requires a greater institutional role. And I would sort of sum it up as the alliance approach. I mean, when the Commission launched the Alliance on Batteries, the Alliance on Hydrogen, at the end of the day, underpinning this concept is the idea of getting some together to kind of specialize and become more competitive at European level on a particular thing which is considered to be critical, like hydrogen, like batteries, and there are several other examples that obviously can be made. But it is not boiling it down to 2 or 3. It is extending that group. So I think sort of mutatis mutandis is that kind of approach that would need to be fostered by institutions to, again, ensure that it is a governing of interdependence. It is about internally and externally. It is about, sort of becoming more in a sense, being able to play our role in a world which is becoming more closed, but not doing this by closing up ourselves.
Many thanks, Natalie. That was a comprehensive answer on both risks. So many thanks indeed. I'm keeping from this discussion the importance that all 3 of you are attaching and the urgency that all 3 of you are attaching to the strategic autonomy agenda. I'm also keeping the significance of ensuring maximum and optimum alignment between transatlantic partners on this topic. I'm keeping the work that you all recognize that needs to happen at home in order to deliver credibly on this agenda. And as far as the EU is concerned, I'm keeping Natalie's insights when it comes to the important questions and risks that underpin some of these policy choices that the EU needs to face and address, if it is, of course, to inject credible meaning to this agenda. Now, we already have some questions from the audience. Let me start with Katharina Hoffmann. Katharina, if you can turn on your camera and please ask your question. Okay, maybe I can ask that. It's a question that is direct. Oh, there she is. Okay, Katharina.
Yeah, sorry, it took a second to get the video started. Just told me that I'm recorded. Very nice to meet you. Thank you, Vasilis, for this excellent moderation. Just to say a second, we prepared together this panel, so I'm very happy that it's working out so fine. And I'm very sorry that Martin Schulz, our chairman, is not able to be here. He had a problem that was not predictable. So he's sending his greetings to all of you. And I would just like to come back to Kati. And I was wondering if you could just give us some concrete examples of what you think could be some actions towards authoritarian players at the moment. You mentioned, of course, China before. I think that's even more complex, but maybe you could say what you think about, for example, Turkey or Poland, let's say actors that are very crucial for the European Union at the moment. Thank you.
Yes, thank you for your question, Katharina. I think, you know, Natalie's last sentence was also about, sometimes it's not even an action, but it's about strengthening our own resilience and, you know, strengthening our own democratic institutions. For instance, specifically on Turkey, I think we could do so much more to help Democrats, you know, help those people in Turkey who still want to, who believe in the European values. We do way, you know, we don't do enough for that. You know, why not offer visa-free travel to the people like we did in the Western Balkans? I know we have 72 rules to which Turkey must apply, but sometimes you have to be creative on how to make sure that at least Turkish society still believes in Europe, even if the leadership, the current leadership, does not. But also, you know, big discussion in the coming up European Council will be to finally start the modernization of the customs union. This is, of course, one of our most important trade tools with Turkey. And I'm pretty shocked, to be honest, that after everything that happened in Turkey, I don't see a single internal domestic thing that has improved. You know, the EU is linking it to how Turkey behaves in its foreign policy, especially vis-a-vis Greece and Cyprus. And then if that behavior is well, we can, you know, we can bring our trade relationship to a higher level. Now, I don't know how to explain that to our friends in Turkey, you know, who see that there had been court rulings by the European Court of Human Rights to release, for instance, Osman Kavala, a person many, I'm sure, of the participants know very well, to release Selahattin Demirtas. We saw yesterday, again, a trial trying to close down one of the biggest political parties in Turkey. And what is the EU doing in the June Council? You know, perhaps trying to start these negotiations because they're behaving better now towards Greece. So I think we have to be much more bold and outspoken in that respect. In Russia, I know it's a debate which is perhaps ended by now, but a debate which is, of course, very much ongoing in Turkey, in Germany, is, of course, our energy independence on a country like Russia. You know, when it comes to kleptocracy, when do we really have transatlantic and together also with the United Kingdom, you know, it's the EU, the US and the UK, which should come together and make sure that, you know, these kleptocrats cannot have their houses and their ships and their sailing boats, etc., in our countries, which is also undermining our own democratic institutions. And then, of course, on China, it's about investment in strategic areas. Look how divided we are in Europe. Only if you look at the Belt and Road Initiative, where half of the EU countries are participating in, look at, you know, how vulnerable the Balkans are, for instance, the Western Balkans, when it comes to Chinese influence. And of course, I also heard Natalie say it, you know, on our technological dependence on a country like China. We have to be much more realistic in that. And I'm happy, at least in my former colleagues in the European Parliament are working, for instance, on the mandatory human rights due diligence when it comes to European companies. And I think you know, we should step it up. If we want to be a credible player, it's not just sanctions, right? Very often the answer in Brussels is always sanctions, new sanctions. And sometimes they are, of course, important. And I very much am very often the first one to actually call for them. But we have so many more tools which we are not using in order to show where our values are and in order to also put pressure on authoritarian regimes.
Many thanks. Since we ended on China, I'm going to ask Mr. John Richmond to ask his question, which dovetails quite well, I believe, with Katharina's question. Mr. Richmond, if you can please turn on your camera and ask the question. I can see you there. You are, please.
Oh, hi there. Hi, sorry, I work in a hospital and I'm working actually at the moment, so.
Yes, do you mind asking your questions and perhaps tell us which speaker is addressed to?
Oh, the question that I posted in the question and answer?
Indeed.
Oh, I was just wondering what, it was for the woman from the Netherlands, I believe, from the Labour Party, the Dutch Labour Party. I was just wondering what, realistically, given the fact that China is actively promoting its model of governance and linking that model of governance to growth and its model of growth, realistically, what leverage the EU would have with regards to liberal democracy and liberal democratic values and sort of the EU project in general in relation to that. It's a new landscape, I think maybe one that we didn't see coming, say, 10 years ago.
Many thanks. That was a question for Kati, but I'd like to ask Natalie and Ian to jump in. Kati, very briefly.
Well, if I'm very honest, I'm sure Natalie and Ian are much more experts on China than I am. So I'm happy to leave the floor to them if that's okay for if that's okay for you.
Please, Natalie.
Yes, well, I mean, I think this, okay, I think there are two sides to the story. I think that the main aspect is, in a sense, sort of, not so much, what do we do to promote our values in China, but how do we prevent authoritarian values that China is promoting from affecting liberal democracy. So, which is why we were having this debate about strategic autonomy in the first place. So, I think that the autonomy agenda has largely got to do with that. Then comes the sort of question of what to do in, let's call it gray zone areas. So areas where, I mean, let's take the Western Balkans, for example. So areas where we thought that, we can make the same argument about Turkey, but Western Balkans is more pertinent given that the Chinese role is kind of more prominent there. We thought that we were going in a certain direction towards democracy, free markets, all good things, and hey, things are going in reverse gear at the moment. And then there's the third set of questions, which is really about, what do we do about human rights abuses in China itself? What do we do about Xinjiang? What do we do about Hong Kong? Now, on that third set of questions, which of course is the most difficult one to address, my personal sort of premise to all this is, whatever it is that we do, let's do it, not because it makes us feel good, but because we actually think that it has more of a chance of having a positive impact. So let's take the Uyghurs, for example. And I think, I don't know enough about it to know what the answer is, but I think the kind of question that should be asked is being vocal about this something that actually helps the conditions of the Uyghurs in Xinjiang? Or does it, in a sense, legitimize further the repression by the Chinese regime? And I can see how the argument could work both ways. I mean, I could definitely see how it could increase the incentives for repression, in the same way as I think that, well, authoritarian countries, including China, actually, if there is one thing they care about, is their reputation. And therefore being vocal about these things does actually not necessarily kind of, lead to all good things, but it does contain the damage. I think, I would personally need to know far more about the way in which China operates to figure out how it is that, how the pros and cons of both options would weigh up. But my point is, that I think that this is the kind of question that should be asked, and unfortunately, I don't think it's normally the question that is asked. I think that normally, when we're talking about democracy, human rights in authoritarian countries, we tend to do it more because it kind of works in our own political systems. And it kind of, we can pat ourselves on the back by kind of speaking out on certain issues, rather than having a real discussion about what is it that is likely to be more effective, or at least ineffective.
Ian? Many thanks, Natalie.
Well, really, I think Natalie more or less said it all. And I think, also much of what she said applies to American policy as well. I mean, the US also thinks about these things, maybe above all thinks about these things in a global way. And so there is a piece of that. I would be skeptical that we're, going to somehow, as a result of our democracy policy, change, internal conditions in China. But there's a demonstration effect. I mean, what you say about the Uyghurs, what you say about Hong Kong, what you say about China affects, the relationship with Russia, where we have some similar objectives. It affects how it's seen in, diverse settings. Belarus, we can make a very long list, in fact. So I do think there's a piece of this that is aspirational, I would say, but if you're not going to take a stand on some of these very big picture global issues, how is it going to be read in smaller settings where maybe you do have a lot more leverage? And I think, just to go back to something that Kati said earlier, I think you're absolutely right about Turkey, and it just strikes me that, the US and Europe share a similar set of concerns, foreign policy concerns, but there are also a set of internal concerns about democracy and media freedom and human rights. And those have sometimes gotten less prominence. This has changed over the years. I think, Kati, once we were in a discussion where you made this point, and it stuck in my mind, actually, that you said you used to go to Washington, and sort of were struck by how much Americans were sort of pushing back on your agenda, that we should be pushing them more on many of these issues. Yes, but it's a strategic relationship. We need to be careful, et cetera, et cetera. It's now reversed. In the United States, that debate about the strategic relationship with Turkey has completely collapsed in the face of both the foreign policy concerns and the domestic policy concerns. Whereas in Europe, you have many voices that are saying, well, yes, but we need to live with this big and useful neighbor, and there's migration policy, and there's all these other things, and our commercial stakes. And what is true, of course, is that that these are not just snapshots, that there is something of a bet on the future in these policies, kind of keeping the flame alive in various places, because in fact, at least in, perhaps not in China, but in some other settings, there are elections, they do change things, and you want to be sort of on the right side of history when that happens.
Many thanks. I'd be tempted to focus more on Turkey, but maybe we can reconvene on that topic in a different setting, in a different format at another time. Let me thank Mr. Richmond for his question. And if anything, it proves the importance of discussing issues that pertain to foreign policy for the middle class, for the working class, since he joined us from his working environment. Now, I believe we have a question from Milica Delevic. Why don't you turn on your camera and ask the question?
Thank you very much, Vasilis and all, for a very interesting session. Basically, my question is dovetails to with the previous discussion and something that you touched in the one before. And that's, we've seen the US recently, the Biden administration, become much more active as a punitive actor in Southeastern Europe, meaning Bulgaria, where high-level power brokers and entities are sanctioned, Albania, where former president and his family are banned from entering the US. And yesterday, executive order published threatening, blocking property and a ban of entry for people in the Western Balkans who destabilize international agreement and sustainable development. So all of this is about respect for the rule of law, anti-corruption, and respect for international agreements. So would this be the right way to pursue the value agenda? And if it is, does it expose the EU as inactive? And can it be that we are seeing a traditional division of labor where EU provides more incentives, US provides punishments, and at least in the case of Turkey, to tie it up, somehow credibility of US punishment is stronger than credibility of incentives that the EU is offering. Thank you.
Many thanks. Who wants to take this? Natalie, please.
I think Nilsa's question is really key, and I think it actually connects very much to the points that were being made previously. I mean, I find it really quite striking the way in which, you know, if you take the period, I would say, sort of beginning in 2010s, you know, when we sort of started seeing the world as becoming multipolar and geopolitical rivalry being back, and the world is big, bad, and ugly, and forget values and norms, and let's all do some chest beating, and we've got to do security and defense, and we were all part of it, right? Which, in a sense, the sort of European Union was kind of, it kind of took a while to realize that, hey, you know, geopolitics is back and therefore we've got to do something about it, yeah? Now we're in a world in which, in a sense, values are returning very much to the foreign policy debate, particularly as, in a sense, the sort of international confrontation is really crystallizing as a confrontation about values. I mean, it's about political ideologies, it's about political systems. And so we see that the United States is actually reinserting norms and values very much in foreign policy. And I think the examples that you cite go very much in that direction. And the paradox is that we, the European Union, I mean, we were the ones that were normative power Europe and civilian power, this and that, and ethical foreign policies. We're kind of behind the curve now because it kind of took us a while to kind of realize the world was becoming big, bad, and ugly, and we had to toughen up. And now that values are back, we don't quite know what to do. And we don't quite know what to do, I think, for a fundamental reason which connects to the point that you were making about sort of positive and negative incentives. I mean, in a sense, we were a normative power in the world when we didn't really have a foreign policy qua foreign policy. We had an enlargement and various types of enlargement light policies. And that world was embedded in what is commonly known as the international liberal order. Now that order has gone, it's not returning, it's gone. And so I think we're struggling with the reality of how do we actually have foreign policies? I mean, I think in the case of the Western Balkans, we are obviously still talking about enlargements, but in any case, you know, how do you interact with the outside in a way which is not necessarily just about chest beating and beating, you know, being big, bad, and ugly, but that reinserts norms and values. And I think that, I mean, largely because, you know, in general, kind of things are slower in the European Union, but I really do feel that we're behind the curve on this debate. Compared to the United States.
Anyone else? Kati, please.
Just very shortly, because I agree with everything that Natalie said. But, you know, for me, there is, for instance, one example. Who is the Commissioner for Enlargement of the European Union? It's Mr. Oliver Varhey, who is, you know, from one of the two EU countries, which according to Freedom House is a hybrid regime. No longer, we can even call it a democracy. That says it all. And I'm so ashamed that Europe has come to this point. And it didn't happen overnight. It happened for a long period of time. And we actually, you know, my parents are Hungarian. I am originally from Hungary. And I've seen this happening for the last 12 years without Europe being able to come up with a strong answer. And it's quite shameful that we had to wait for a new administration in the White House, you know, to actually, again, remind us what human rights and, you know, what it is to stand up for values. And this is where I really think that we have cozied up too much to these authoritarian states. We let them too much freedom. And for me, you know, there's one foreign policy area where the whole rule of law question is the most important. It's our enlargement policy. So it does matter who you put in that position. And it shows enough, I think, about the state of Europe that we all accepted, although we did make him do a re-exam in the European Parliament. But let's be honest, in the end, he's sitting there, he's pleading to open negotiation chapters with Vučić in Serbia, while we have all the reports about the state of democracy and kleptocracy in Serbia happening. So this is, for me, one of the painful examples how we are not always living up to what we preach to do.
Vasilis, if I may, could I just add something to that?
Yeah.
No, I mean, it's an excellent question. And I'm, you know, I would just take something that Natalie said, maybe even a step further, which is to say that, you know, we went through this phase of waking up to this sort of hard power geopolitical competition that's come back in a vigorous way. And then you've got this sort of values struggle going on. In fact, the two things are now mutually reinforcing. It's not one or the other. We have both. We're living in a world of both. And there's a third aspect, which I think also plays into this, maybe in different ways on both sides of the Atlantic. You know, there's this growing anxiety about our own democracies, you know, because there's a fear that in this values space, these things have, in a sense, to use this overused expression, become weaponized, that there are now others trying to insert their very different sort of ideas about values and transparency and whatever it might be, and also criminality, into our own systems, you know. And so in a sense, this is no longer just about foreign policy. It's also, you know, about domestic policy. There's a kind of intermestic character to this, which is, you know, it's both maybe inevitable, but also can be very, very toxic.
Many thanks. I think we would all agree about the collapse of the boundaries between external and internal. And in light of that, we have one final question from our audience, from Mr. Gunther Mathusens, if I'm pronouncing the surname correctly. Please make it super short because we're running a little bit short on time. Why don't you turn on your camera? And in the meantime, let me also thank Milica for her question. Mr. Mathusens, please.
Yes. Wait. Do you hear me?
We can hear you very
well. The camera I can't start the camera, but
that's fine. Well, okay. Why don't you ask your question?
Okay. The question was just that can we really truly believe that regimes like Putin's Russia and Lukashenko, Belarus, and all that, that they are going to be impressed if we don't show the ability of using hard power ourselves? Always bearing in mind that we have our values, our democracy, internal cohesion, and all that, but that if we always reply with words and sanctions, that really doesn't hurt Putin, it doesn't hurt Lukashenko, it hurts their people. And I doubt whether regimes like that are going to be impressed by sanctions, because basically I can imagine Putin himself, he just doesn't care.
Many thanks. Any takers for this one? Natalie, please.
Yeah, just very, very briefly. I mean, I think that, I think this raises the broader question, which is connected also to Milica's question of, you know, in a world in which our, in a sense, relative power has declined, can we simply continue relying on the same instruments as we used in the past in order to have impact? And I think it's really a $1 million question, yeah? Having said that, I do think that there are a number of things to bear in mind. I mean, I think when it comes to hard power, I think there are lessons of the past which basically tell us that the use of hard power when we don't like regimes is not a very good idea either. I mean, just look at what we're doing now in Afghanistan. After 20 years of having basically, unfortunately, lost a war, we're leaving because we don't know what else to do. You know, I wouldn't exactly would like to be in the shoes of an Afghan woman these days. So, you know, not to mention, you know, sort of Iraq. So, you know, not to mention Libya. So I think that hard power is not necessarily an answer when it comes to human rights abuses. I think sanctions require a little bit more thought, you know, in the sense that, in all honesty, I think both when it comes to Russia, particularly when it comes to Belarus, we actually haven't tried sanctions that really bite yet. Let's try and do that first and see what happens. And then thirdly, I think that there can be a lot more work to be done in terms of, which is the connected to a point that Kati was mentioning, also with respect to Turkey, in terms of supporting civil society. Now, it may be that these things don't have effect either. But I think, and it could be that there is nothing that works. I mean, it's not necessarily that our instruments are necessarily going to be effective, and certainly not in the short term. But I think that there is a lot more scope to be explored, in a sense, within these two policy strands.
I can see Ian wanting to intervene.
Yeah,
Ian.
I mean, you know, I would agree with that. I mean, you know, there's such a long sort of history of study of sanctions and whether they work or not. One of the great lessons, it seems, is that they actually work rather well with your friends. You know, the closer you are, both physically and in terms of many, many different kinds of ties, you know, friends, I use that, you know, sort of broadly, you know, places that you have many connections with, where there's more interdependence. Turkey is a good example of this potentially, actually. But you also see it obviously in terms of trade policy across the Atlantic, unfortunately. But there, you know, they really do, in fact, they can work. You know, Natalie puts it very, very well. It may, you know, it may not matter. They may not work. None of these things may, in fact, work. You know, with Belarus, for example. I mean, if regime survival is the only real consideration in Minsk, then there's very little that you're going to do that's going to work in the sanctions realm. In fact, there are a lot of things that you could do, and we had experience with this in the Balkans in the 1990s, that actually reinforce the power of governing elites. You make things scarce, and it reinforces the authority of central government. So there can be perverse effects of sanctions as well, not to mention the humanitarian piece of it. Did it work with Venezuela? No, not really. Iran, doubtful. I mean, we can make a very long list of this. What does it do? It mobilizes people. It's a vehicle it can be a vehicle for consensus among like-minded states, and conditions do change over time. But how far do you push it? And this goes to the question that was asked with Russia, for example, or with China. I mean, are we willing to push this far enough in the realm of hard power that you pay a stability price? Well, I'm not sure we want to do that with a nuclear armed adversary, or even with others. I mean, it's a really tough sort of thing. But obviously, we're moving into a world where, you know, things aren't necessarily going in the direction of of greater democratic progress. And therefore, we need to rethink all of these instruments. I don't know what the answer is precisely.
Many thanks. And I would add that the same problematic, the same tough choice doesn't only apply to the punitive dimension, but also to the positive agenda. How do you ensure that an agenda of incentives, of positive engagement, doesn't reinforce a regime rather than enhance the resilience of the people? We have about 3 minutes, so I'm going to try something as a last lightning round. I'm going to ask you to each reply to one single question, and it's a little bit more of a political question. We've talked a lot about strategic autonomy, contestation, significance, some of the implications of it, the dynamics of it. But putting that into more into the political realm, I want to ask you, to what extent do you think that strategic autonomy or sovereignty, as it's known in certain contexts and member states, should be a guiding principle for progressives to define the 2020s, this decade. So very quickly, starting Ian, Natalie, and then Kati.
Well, look, I mean, you know, I don't think this is going to be the center of gravity for progressives on either side of the Atlantic. There are a lot of other things out there, but to the extent that it is a concern, I think, you know, it may be very useful if it serves exactly the objective that you were talking about earlier of convincing society that you have a foreign policy and a international economic policy and other things that are in their basic interest. But you have to be very careful with it, though, it seems to me, because it so easily slips over into something which is protectionist and, you know, that is nationalist and that is in fact destabilizing. So, I mean, my answer is sort of use with care.
Many thanks. Natalie.
Yes, I think the same thing. I mean, I think this is one can call it what you want, but I mean, as I said, I see the European autonomy agenda as being akin to the foreign policy for the middle class agenda. I mean, I think we're basically talking about the same thing, which kind of obviously does chime with a progressive agenda, but a progressive agenda which remains open and hence handled with care. Going back to Ian.
Use responsibly twice. And Kati?
That's the danger when you only ask progressives, right? Then you get kind of similar answers. I mean, you know, like I said, I don't think it's a means to an end, right? So it's one of the instruments. In this, I very much agree. It's not that we have to have the strategic autonomy. It is that strategic autonomy can help us achieve things which are important for progressives. I think more equality, addressing climate change in a way that we address it in a fair way, that everyone can come along, which is in a different way than some others want to do it. And when it comes to foreign policy, it's one where we, you know, where we have this value-based foreign policy, where we do respect and speak out when human rights and democracy are, when we see the erosion happening in that field. So I would say means to an end, to achieve those progressive policies, which I think we all want to achieve on both sides of the transatlantic.
Many thanks. I think that, you know, we can all agree that it will not be the ultimate, the top priority. Nonetheless, that doesn't mean that it shouldn't be a priority. And I think for a topic that will remain timely and vital for a long time, and one where, despite the progress made, there is a lot of uncertainty surrounding it, I'm of the opinion that it would be wise and indeed necessary for the progressives not just follow the debates, but lead the debates regarding its policy content. There is a need for reflection. There's also a need for delivery, neither of which is sufficient alone to guarantee that strategic autonomy, sovereignty, or however you want to call it, does not end up getting filled with a regressive, protectionist, or isolationist meaning. Now, we've covered a lot, an impressive amount of questions and topics, subtopics, I should say. For this reason, let me thank once more our wonderful panel, Ms. Piri, Ms. Tochi, and Mr. Lesser, for helping us guide through the complexity, the uncertainty, the urgency that surrounds this topic. Many thanks indeed. A big thanks is also owed to the fantastic teams at DPZ, FES, and FEPS for all the hard work that has been put into this. So many thanks to the back office and to the colleagues back in the office. And of course, many thanks to all of you for attending and participating. After reminding you to please fill out the feedback form that the PGS team has already shared in the chat, I will leave you with a very short quote, which may or may not bear resemblance to what we've discussed. The quote is by the famous Greek novelist, Nikos Kazantzakis, who said, "There are no ideas, there are only people who carry these ideas. And these ideas get the height, the stature of the people who carry them." Many thanks to everyone. Enjoy your afternoon. And of course, please stay tuned for the rest of the program of the 2021 Progressive Governance